Welcome back to the discussion, Generating More Value for Your Data, sponsored by Commvault and NetApp on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Richard Breakiron, the Senior Director for Strategic Initiatives for Federal at Commvault, Dave DeVries, the Senior Director for Strategic Initiatives for State, Local, and Education, also for Commvault, and Kirk Kern, the Chief Technology Officer for NetApp Americas. Last segment, we started talking a little bit about what data protection is, and we talked about reliability and durability and things of that nature. Let's move to the next part of this discussion, which is, okay, you have reliability, you have durability, all those important pieces, but now agencies are starting to move to a hybrid cloud setup. And not just hybrid cloud, but it also will impact business processes. It's going to drive changes for both demand and how the business works. So Dave, let me bring you into this. Let's start there. Help me work with me through this. The hybrid cloud, how's that impact kind of your data environment?
First off, what is a hybrid cloud? It could be a variety of things. It could be because of my acquisition processes within the federal sector, within the state and local side of the house. Oftentimes, we may have a requirement that comes up, and how we go to get the bids back from industry may drive what is awarded out there. And suddenly, if I'm a CIO of a federal agency or a CIO of a state agency, I may find myself with different technologies there, each representing good technologies, but how do I manage my data there? And that came about because of the acquisition processes that I had to comply with. So that's really what I call the hybrid cloud. It's I have my data as an organization in different clouds out there, and it may be because of the acquisition thing, or it may be because of cost, i.e., this is a highly available one, and I'm going to pay more, but I need to have my data there. Or I don't need to have as much, so it's more of a cold storage. And through the acquisition process, I put it into here. By having that and knowing where my hybrids are and how I can manage my data loads or my workloads, I can move those things. And that's why it's so critical to know where your data is, what your options are, and can you do it there without expending a lot of time on surveying it, studying it to death, calling in other contractors to help you with it. How can I just manage my data?
And Dave, you and I have talked about this before, and it's just so important to recognize that when you look at one of the first initiatives the federal government had was to do a cloud first. Well, all of a sudden now it is the hybrid cloud. And that really is, as you described, Dave, the business processes sort of all of a sudden made people realize that there are some data that has got to remain on-premise. There's some data that fits the cloud really, really well. And it's incumbent upon the organization's leadership to really take ownership of their business processes and the value of the data and where that data is. We now live in a world that has been digitized. And what I mean by that is you can reach data from anywhere. But I tell you, reaching data when it's in a cloud gives a lot more opportunity to people than when they have to maybe go through a VPN or another security procedure to get to data on premise. So great initiatives in being able to get the right information at the right time to the right people, regardless of where they are in the world, and such a key piece.
And one of the pieces that we've talked, I think, over the time before is agencies, generally speaking, may have moved stuff to the cloud because that was the cloud first mentality. Okay, let's do that. But then they realized, wow, that's really costing me a lot of money to have all this data in the cloud. And that was where we got toward the hybrid setup, which is where agencies are, okay, this belongs in the cloud, this maybe doesn't, and now we're going to have the two different setups, but they have to be interconnected. That also is going to drive your processes as well. I don't know, Kirk, you want to jump in on this a little bit and talk a little bit about how that decision-making process about what goes in the cloud and what doesn't, the workloads issue?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting you mentioned business process. If you go back and look at how customers and agencies are exploiting data today, they're clearly creating new business processes and disrupting legacy ones. And so if you look at the big triangle that's out there, the people, process, and technology, what happens when you disrupt those existing processes? So if in fact data becomes this automated and orchestrated element where it can flow freely into the cloud and back out, that means that decisions, and anytime you have a person in the loop or a human in the loop, that's going to delay your ability to generate information or intelligence from that data. So clearly that dictates you have to go back and change process, right? You can no longer have a process that in order for a person to gain access to this data, he fills out a form and then it gets approved by a manager, and then subsequently they open up the permissions on it. We live in a world now where, you know, access is available via an API. You make a networking call via that API, you have instantaneous access to that information. And so, you know, people are really adaptable. They'll quickly switch from sort of the legacy mode to the next generation mode without much of an issue. And then that data can be available in the cloud, on-prem, or across multiple clouds for that matter. And so it really goes back to the agencies and the way they can modify their processes, or more specifically, you know, the regulations on how they control, manage, and release data out to the public. And so there's, you know, I think they have to go back and do a lot of work around on process or certification and releasability of data.
Yeah, and one thing, Kurt, it's so right. Exactly everything you described. Just in an engagement this morning with one of the major Army enterprise customers, and their aspect was they have learned so much on integrating hybrid cloud into processes. And what they've learned is, you know what, we made a mistake. Everybody said cloud was the cheapest way to go, but there was a business decision, and all of a sudden when a bill came into them literally that had sort of been clocking around, you know, $1 million a month, went up to $8 million. Somebody said, hey, what happened? They said, oh, we put our Splunk environment up into the cloud. And somebody said, oh my gosh. And so there are these aspects of, I think when we look at hybrid cloud, and Dave started the discussion as to, you've got to understand that some of what we're being driven to in the government with respect to data management, cloud, and on-prem decisions, it has to be considered the cost aspects of that too.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, the cost for storage in the cloud is typically advertised at you know, very low rates. But then what happens is you start to aggregate all these a la carte charges, right? If your access does in fact come from outside of the cloud, that means the data that's in the cloud has to egress from the cloud back to your on-premise data center, and so you pay outbound charges for that data. Depending on the data type of storage model employed, that you also have to pay by transaction, right? So the more puts or gets you do against a particular object, you're going to pay for every 1,000 puts and gets, for instance. And then if you want to doubly protect that information, which means, hey, I want to replicate that from one region to another region, or potentially from one region in the CONUS to OCONUS, there's also these charges that get accrued whenever you do cross-region or cross-zone transfers. And so, you know, data at rest, not being touched, very, very cheap in the cloud. The more you access it, or the more you do information processing on it, then you start to see your a la carte charges come up. That's where the government struggles, right? Because they clearly know that those charges are there, but they have a hard time predicting demand. And so, you know, how do I model, you know, if I put a big, whatever, let's say a, you know, 500 petabyte repository in the cloud, how much demand will be there from, you know, sources outside of my agencies that want to access that information? There's been a couple examples already with some of our civilian agencies where they've built these data sets, only to find that they're also responsible for the outbound charges whenever customers outside of the government start to access and process that data.
I think within this whole COVID epidemic that we're going through right now, the agencies are learning that their data was not just consumed by their agency. They knew it was being consumed by somebody else, but they really didn't see it in a real-time mode. A lot of that stuff today is in a real-time mode. You're finding it back on the news that night. Other agencies are calling you up. Other agencies, as Kirk pointed out, they're going to your APIs and just pulling that stuff in. And so it is about knowing what the data is across the different storage capacities that you have, and how are you managing that, and then sharing it out securely.
All right, that's a great point. Actually, I was going to ask you to follow up on that, because how many agencies really know what they have? So we're going to take a quick break and come back. Maybe that's one of the questions we can continue to look into. But in the meantime, you're listening to the discussion, Generating More Value for Your Data, sponsored by Commvault and NetApp on Federal News Network.